G'day there. You're watching the Aussie Boom Guru, and today we're going to be covering a lesson on building a drop-down form, which, as we'll talk about later, isn't the true name for the form, but it's the one I like to call it. You'll have to forgive me with my voice. I've got a little bit of a cold at the moment, but I'll do my best to project and be understandable. So the goals today is we're looking at a form that's a little bit more complicated than the message box we built in lesson 13. In this case, we're going to be constructing a form using the Windows form system. So we're going to be building a form that passes through a set of keys to a list, and we can pick from that list one object and then pass the value that that key represents on the other side. So I'll be building on what we already have. So if you don't already have an add-in or toolbar, feel free to get mine off of GitHub in my YouTube C# repo. In this case, you can find any state of lesson that we find. So in this case, you'll want the lesson 13 toolbar, which will help get you started. So Winforms or Windows Forms are a pretty old system now that's been provided by Microsoft that allows fairly simple form construction and also the development of ultimately a user interface, which we can call on in our code and actually process more complex outcomes than just a standard interaction. So Visual Studio luckily gives us a visual editor to build forms that does a lot of the work with actually constructing the form as code. It does a lot of this for us. This makes it great for beginners, or even eventually when you're building basic forms as an experienced C# developer, you might still find Windows Forms sufficient in a lot of cases. Now, of course, the big question here, why not just use WPF or Windows Presentation Foundation forms? It's a very popular topic, this one, and I know I'm probably going to disappoint some people by not starting in WPF straight away, but having used WPF and had to learn it myself, I honestly can confess it is harder. There is more to learn, it's more complex, you can do more things with it, but with that comes more things to teach. So I am going to be focusing on Windows Forms, at least for this portion of the series, and I'll return to WPF later on, when we use forms that really do specifically need WPF to function. The series is mostly about introducing things in stages, rather than throwing it all at you at once. If I jumped into WPF forms now, I think I'd be doing you a disservice by skipping Windows Forms because they honestly still get used by a lot of people for basic forms. Now, WPF does have a lot of good things. It allows you to customize the appearance of your forms, add more complicated behaviors, and take advantage of things like data bindings, which Windows Forms isn't going to as readily support, but it allows us to focus on the basics of constructing a form. So we're going to be looking at a form that has these components, effectively a title, a cancel box, a close box, or up in the top right. We're going to have a label, which just sends a tooltip to the user explaining the purpose of the form, and then the combo box. So in this case, it's not actually called a dropdown, it's called a combo box in Windows Forms. I just call it a dropdown form overall because it's an abstracted and more easy to understand name for people that aren't programmers. We're going to be taking advantage of a system that is important to know, and if you've used data shapes for Dynamo, you'll be familiar with these terms, keys and values. So in this case, keys and values also relate to things like dictionaries. We're not actually going to use a dictionary in this case, we're just going to be working with two parallel lists, because order of objects is going to be pretty important to us in this case. So when you use WPF, you can actually bind data to objects in the form specifically to avoid having to do more behind form code. In this case, we are going to be working mostly with behind code in our form, so separate code that controls the behavior of our form. So we're going to look at our form as sort of like just a display, something that sends information to the user about what's happening behind the scenes with the objects in our form. This is going to be a very straightforward scenario for behind code. We're going to look at some more complicated ones in future videos. So we're going to be doing a few things to prepare our form. First of all, I'm going to create a method in our toolbar that allows us to dynamically set the icon of a form. And the reason I do this is because if you actually assign an icon as a resource to a form, it's not going to be connected to all your other forms. So I think it's better to actually set the icon outside the form's setup. And that way you can use one icon across multiple forms. You're going to need a 16 by 16 pixel icon or ICO file, which can generally be created in Photoshop and converted using lots of free utilities online. As well as this, we're then going to create our Windows form using the visual editor, and then actually create the base method that we use to call this form and process its outcomes using the form results class that we've used previously. We're then going to extend the revision class in our toolbar so that we can have a name for a revision, so a simple name creator. And then finally, we're going to customize the base form into a customized form that will focus on the selection of revisions. So without further ado, let's jump in to our toolbar. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually add a method. Well, actually, I'm first going to add an icon, I should say. So under icon 16, I'm going to add my ICO icon, which I've created. And the purpose of this is just to be assigned to the icon of my form. Now I might also need to just check my manifest. In this case, we need to make sure that we are loading ICO files, which we're currently not. So I'm also going to have to come down to my item group here and just also specify ICO in these two steps of my toolbar, which should enable these to just automatically be treated as embedded resources, and they'll be part of my DLL when it's created for my add-in. So just like we handled our icons, we've also now captured PNG files, we've also captured ICO files. Excellent. So I can now close that, and we're just going to jump down to utilities. It's not really a ribbon utility, it's more of a file utility. So we're going to start creating a new class. So I'm going to add a new item, and we're going to call this file utilities. So this is going to be used later on, especially for dealing with reading and writing files. But it's just a general file management static class. So again, just a reminder, we do associate to the namespace. So in this case, you'll recall we use the utility namespace, which we're still using. But then we want a public static class, which we will then store static methods in that we can call on, treating this sort of like an object in principle. So in this case, I'm going to create a public static void method. So it's not actually going to return anything. It's going to assign an icon. So I'm going to call this set form icon. It's going to take one argument, which is the form. So in this case, we may also want to specify a form. Sometimes this can be an ambiguous reference. Notice in this case, it's Autodesk Revit DB form. This isn't actually the form that we want to reference. So we're going to come up to our usings, and we're going to say using form equals system windows forms form. And this will now specify that when we reference form, we're talking about Windows forms, which we want this to be the case. I might just double check also. I'm not sure if our project is currently set to use Windows Forms. No, it's not. So in this case, I might just double check another project that I'm referencing, because this is actually something that's not in the template by default. And I just want to make sure I get the property right. So this is actually in my toolbar from GitHub, which effectively I'm sort of building towards in our series. And you'll notice that I've added a property once it loads. See this used Windows forms. So we're going to have to add this property to our toolbar, because otherwise it doesn't really know that it should be using Windows forms as a type of form in the toolbar. So there we go. This will now help our project know that Windows forms are supported. We can see that use WPF is there by default, which we'll come back to later. But for now, we just want this use Windows forms property. There we go. So that will now help us use these later on. So now that we have our form, we're going to return to the idea of using a stream to get an item or object from our manifest. So we're going to say, firstly, that our icon path that we use is going to be a fixed path in this case. So we're going to follow, in this case, guru, and we're following the folder structure, resources, icon 16. So I'll just open that resource. And then we also need to specify the file name. So in this case, the file name I'm using is iconlist16.ico. So it's a fixed path. This thing is never really going to move around or change. This could, of course, be an argument if we wanted to. In fact, if we really wanted to, I can actually add an extra argument and call this icon path and make it null by default. And we can actually take advantage of the null coalescing operator and just say the icon path question mark equals. So in the case that the icon path isn't specified, it will be null, and then it will default to this particular icon, which gives you a little bit more flexibility if you want to use that method for different icons later on. I'm now going to use my using statement. And again, we're going to create a stream like we did before with our icons. I'm going to call on globals.assembly. So we're getting our assembly from our global variables. And we're getting the manifest resource stream for the icon path, which effectively means we're getting that icon and we're streaming it into bits or bytes. And now we can actually work with it. So I'm firstly going to make sure the stream actually worked. So we can say not equal to or is not null. Make sure it is a stream. And then I just need to set the icon property of the form we've provided to a new icon based on the stream, which is a valid constructor for icon. And that's effectively it. So we can call on this method later on when we build our form to dynamically assign the icon to the form rather than having to store it to the form as a resource, which is going to be harder if you have multiple forms all using the same icon. I'm just going to clean this up, just call that system. And later on, we can just, of course, come back and annotate that if we need to. So that's the first step covered. This is a fairly separate step to actually building the form. So now we're actually going to construct a form. Pretty exciting. So we're just going to minimize this. And I'm going to expand forms and create a new folder. And I'm going to call this bases. So I like to refer to forms as custom or base. A base form is effectively a class built to be called on in a form method. So this is never actually going to be used like a method. It's actually the form itself. But then we call on the base in a method to create the actual behavior of calling on a form and processing its result. So what I'm going to do now is just add another folder here, and I'm just going to call this Winforms. I'm specifying specifically these are going to be Winform bases. I'm going to add a new item, and instead of a class, I'm going to now pick, in this case, a Windows form. Which is probably sitting right in front of me, somewhere in here. Yeah, interesting, where is it? Interesting, I can't see Windows form. I'm wondering if maybe I need to unload and reload my project to get that property to take effect. So I'll just do a right click. So if you can actually unload and reload your project, if you right click here and go unload project, reload with dependencies, just going to sometimes sort of like refresh certain changes you've made that haven't registered yet. So I think that should hopefully be sufficient. Maybe I'll now see Windows form. I don't. So maybe I need to actually close and reboot the project. Now I might be missing something incredibly obvious here, so apologies for people watching if I've literally just like missed something right under my nose. Just bear with me. Like many people know, I do tend to record in one take, so you get to see the errors and the cock-ups and all the things that I do wrong, because I think it makes for a more natural experience, and it also reminds you that I'm not perfect. Let's try that again. There we go, Windows form. So I think the property probably hadn't taken effect yet. That's probably why that happened. So I like to call my base form classes base and then the name of the form. So I'm going to call this base dropdown. And I'm going to go add. So this is actually going to add a few objects. It's not just going to add a class. It's going to add a dedicated form object and some supporting files. So it's currently not quite right. I think I might have picked the wrong control there. That doesn't quite look right. I'll just try that again. User control now. We want a Windows form. Windows form. It was right above it. So there we go. So now we want a base drop down, and this should hopefully look correct now. So this is going to start off a visual editor for the form. Now this is a really common thing that happens. This is where the ambiguity between system forms and Revit forms can sometimes take effect. The reason this is happening, so don't freak out, the reason this happens is because we are using implicit loadings or implicit usings. So by default, most of your code will be trying to access the Revit DB. It will be trying to find things that are available to the project. And in this case, we hit what's called an ambiguity, which means that the forms reference can't be rationalized between Revit forms and Windows forms. This is quite common. I haven't found a way to do this within Visual Studio. So what I actually recommend doing at this point is closing Visual Studio and opening your project instead from Windows. So in this case, I'm just going to jump to my toolbar location. And we're just going to navigate our project like a Windows folder. And we're going to be looking for that base class. So I'm now just going to just boot up Notepad. I'll just use regular old Notepad, nothing special. And we're just going to firstly open the CS file, the non-designer file. And as we can see here, there is a little bit of ambiguity in the fact that we're calling form. So like we did before, we're going to say using form equals system, Windows, forms, form. And that should fix the ambiguity. We're also just going to take off, in this case, the Winforms from the namespace. We just want this to be guru.forms.bases. Now in this case, I'm actually going to call this base instead of bases. I just want it to be base forms as the namespace. We're then going to also get our designer. And likewise, I don't believe we need to fix the ambiguity in this particular case, but we're also just going to re-rationalize the namespace itself. So this is actually Windows generated code. So you're generally not going to want to do a lot with the designer file. It's really managed for you through the visual editor. But this is our behind code, which we're going to work with more specifically. So now we should be able to boot up Visual Studio again and reopen our project, and it should now construct our form correctly in the visual editor. So if we go back to this file, we should hopefully see a basic form, or at least the start of a basic form, fingers crossed. And there we go. So this is obviously a very interesting form, not a lot going on, but by default we get a title, we get a minimize, maximize, and close button. And if we go to properties, we're going to see we have a lot of properties available about our form to work with. So some of these things we can change probably straight away. In this case, if you want a resizable form, you can leave the form border style to sizable. If you don't want to change, you can make it fixed single. I personally always make my forms a little bit resizable because sometimes on some computers, especially 4K monitors, I've found that the forms can change in size a little bit and your buttons might actually fall off the bottom of the form. So I like to leave a little bit of resizability. As well as this, we've got the text, which is the name of the forms. We can leave that. We can either leave that alone or we can change it into a title such as select an object, and we'll notice the change takes effect in the title over here. As well as this, I'm just working my way down. Generally, in terms of anything else we want to change, there's nothing really I can see yet. We might want to set a minimum size to the form. So sometimes if you know your form's not going to get any smaller than, say, 450 by 250, which you can change here, you can always enforce a minimum size so that you can resize your form, but you can't make it smaller than a certain size. And this will be how the form behaves in Revit when we call it as well. So I generally recommend figuring out the smallest size that your form should be and setting it as a minimum. You can always set a maximum if you wish, or you can just leave the maximum up to the user when they stretch it. The start position as well, generally I like to make that center screen so that it begins at the center of the screen, or you can also do center parent so that it starts at the center of the application that owns the form, but I'll just use center screen for now. You can also change the window state to start minimized, maximized, etc. I'm just saying normal. You can associate accept and cancel buttons, but I prefer to manage this in behind code. We can take away the control box if we want. So the control box in this case is the close box. I generally take away minimize and maximize controls, but it's up to you whether you want to. I like my forms to stay visible. In this case, that's effectively pretty much all the properties that we want to change in this form. The next thing we need to do is actually add some controls to it. So let's begin with some buttons. Now, over here in the toolbox, there's a lot of form controls. We're just going to look at common controls and containers. So you can start dropping buttons and labels and all sorts of things in the canvas, but you're going to have to start thinking about how these things move around and anchor to your form as it changes in size. To begin with, I find it really great as a beginner to set up a table layout. So what we're going to do is just go to containers and we're going to make a table layout panel. Now this isn't necessarily a conventional way to build a form, but I think it's a great way as a beginner. So we're actually going to take away, in this case, the column. So I might just go edit rows and columns actually. So I'm just going to delete a column and just say that this is just going to auto size itself. It's just one column and we're going to have 3 rows. So the first row we have is going to be our label. The middle row is going to be our drop down and the bottom row is going to be our OK and our cancel button. So I'm just going to say by default, the bottom row is 60 pixels high. The top row is 60 pixels high. And the middle is just going to basically just fill to suit. So I think auto size should probably work in this case. No, I think I need to actually specify that it fills up 100% of the remainder. And we can see now that we'll have this table that maintains two 60 pixel rows, and then we have the leftover in the middle. So what I can do with this is I can either anchor it to the sides of the form, or I can just tell it to dock to the form. So in this case, I'm just going to go down to the docking settings for this and just say you dock to the middle of the form. And now when your form changes size, this will just flex to suit. And you can see the minimum prevents us from sort of breaking that middle row. Now, this isn't necessarily the way I think people tend to build Windows forms. I just find it's really useful when you're really trying to specifically lay out your form. The cool thing about tables is you can nest them. So I'm going to create another table layout in here, and I'm just going to remove, in this case, a row. Whoops, I'm going to remove a row. And I'm just going to tell this to effectively also fill this part of the form. So I'm going to go to the anchoring settings and say that you are top, left, right, bottom anchored. And we can see that we can fill the form. As well as this, I can also implement some margins. So let's say the left, this is left, top, right, bottom. I'm going to say left is 16, top is 4, right is 16, and bottom is 16. And we can inset that margin system as well. You may also want to come back to your main grid and just take off all the margins and say you aren't meant to margin. You just fill the whole space. And now we can actually place buttons in these grids. So rather than having to size and control all the buttons, we can just lock them to these grids. So under common control, I'm just going to make a button. And I'm also just going to make another one. And it knows already, obviously I want to go to the other one. So these are two button controls. I'm just going to go down and I'm going to rename these. So in this case, the name of this one should be, actually we need the name and the text. So text is what you see, and name is actually what this thing is called. So generally I like to call these button and then their name. So button OK and button cancel. And we want to also change the text of this button to cancel. And we want these to fill with no margin. So in this case, I'm just going to say their margin is 0, 0, 0, 0. We want them to be top, right, left, bottom, and they fill that whole spot. Now, actually, I want to put a right margin of 4. I tend to like to leave 8 between my buttons and then 16 between the edge of my buttons and the form. So I'm just using my controls here to sort of set that up. So left will be 4, 0, 0, 0. Top, left, right, bottom. And we now have two buttons that will now flex with the form as it changes in size and sort of maintain a good resolution with the form. So you can see that tables really help this happen. I like to often change the size of these a little bit and make them just a bit bigger. So maybe 14, well, it's pretty big actually. Maybe we'll just do 10. We'll try 10. Yeah, that's a bit better. Because 8 is quite small. Okay, the next thing we need to do is create a label that we can use to tell the user what to do with the drop-down input. So I'm going to go back to my toolbox, and in this case, we need to include a label, which is sort of like fixed text, and there it is. Again, we're going to want to re-justify this, so we're going to say the text by default is select an object, and we'll say the text align in this case is just centered, and we also need to anchor this to all sides of this part of the form. And now we can see it centered, and we'll just change its name to label tooltip, or message, I guess we'll call it, label message. And then we just need to change its size. I'm just going to make this 10, again, a bit bigger. And the last thing we need is our combo box. So in this case, under toolbox, we're going to come over to our combo box input. There it is. And again, we're just going to center this in this case. Whoop. There's our context. It's up to you what size you want to make the drop down. We'll just make the text maybe 10, which makes the combo box a bit taller. The size is going to be automatically based on the combo box. Then we need to anchor this combo box to all sides of the form. And we're going to want to also probably center it. I don't know if I can center it in this case. I can margin it. We might just actually margin it just under the instruction. I think that's probably a more logical location. So we'll set the margins as 16 from the edge of the form, 4 16 from the edge of the form, and 4. And we can now try to figure out, I guess, our minimum size based on this. So at the moment, this probably is a little bit bigger than it needs to be. We can probably make that a little bit smaller in height. So let's say the minimum size is maybe 200. Let's see how this looks. That looks a bit better. So there we go. This is probably like the smallest size you'd want that form to be. But you can see now that we have a flexible form that grows in size. The controls stay in logical locations as the form changes in size. But our base form size is very sensible. So what we have now is the front end of a form. What we don't have is the back end. So how do we actually set this up? Well, the first thing we're going to do is add some events to our objects. So we need only 2 events in this form. One is when you hit OK, and one is when you hit cancel. So I'm going to start with my OK button. And I'm going to go to this little lightning bolt, which is events. And you'll see there's a lot of events available for these objects. Lots of things, even like when your mouse goes over the button, what happens? So you can do things like change the colors of your buttons when they're moused over. Even when their size changes, you can do all sorts of things. But the main thing we're capturing here is click. What happens when you click it? So in this case, I'm just going to call this button, OK, click. So I like to call these the name of the object underscore the event name. And this is going to take us to the behind code of our form, which technically lives sort of further down in here in this designer. I'm going to go back to my form, and I also want to add an event to the cancel button. So I'm just going to change OK to cancel, and there we go. So this form is effectively done at the front end, so we're just going to close it. It's good to go. We will remember some things like the name of some of these properties, like this select an object input, which I might actually just give a margin to while I'm at it. So it doesn't currently have one. It's going to do 4. Sorry, I'll do actually 4 on all sides. Doesn't really matter, but I'm just doing it for consistency. So remember, this thing is called label message. We're going to come back and override the name of this. This thing we haven't actually given a name to yet, so let's just go back down to its name property. Combo box, and we'll just call this combo box. It's a combo box. There's nothing really special about it. And these are going to be called, in this case, button OK and button cancel. So we need to remember that when we're working in our form. So now we're in our behind code. Now between the form and the behind code, there's also a designer. As it will tell you, this is going to be all generated by Windows Forms. So we generally shouldn't touch it. But behind here, this is why Windows Forms are so good. They're writing all of this code for us. And this is doing all the styling, all the settings that we've just set up, the names of things, the text of things, adding events to things. So this is really obfuscating a lot of the challenging stuff from us, and we don't even have to worry about it. You're generally not going to want to change this. Sometimes you may have to, if say you've added an event and you want to get rid of it, you may have to come into the behind code or into the designer code to get rid of it, but generally most of the time, just leave it alone. So now we're in our behind code. So what do we have by default? Well, we have a constructor and we have our 2 events. Now, one of our events is very straightforward. We're going to program this cancel click event straight away. And this is just going to be this. Now, this refers to the form. When we say this, we're talking about the form that we're working with in this particular class. And we're just going to close it. So when we hit the cancel button, the form will just close. That's it. That's all that will happen. Now, we do know eventually that our OK button is also going to close the form, but it's also going to pass some results out of the form as well. So for now, that will do. What we're going to do before we focus on our constructor is we're going to add some properties to the form that we can use to reference things anywhere in our form class. So I'm going to create private variables in this case because they only need to be used inside the form itself. So I'm going to make a list of strings, and I'm going to call this list keys. And I'll use a capital in this case, given it's a private variable. You can initialize them. I tend not to initialize them as variables. I tend to do that in the constructor so that the user knows where to find them. Now, keys are going to be the things that we show to the user in the form at the surface level, but values are going to be the thing that we actually do behind the scenes. These can be things like objects that can come back out the other end of the form and be cast into the original class that we passed through, such as a revision, which we're going to be doing. Now, it already knows we sort of want to work with values, but we're not going to work with a string. We're going to work with an object. So you may remember that objects are a very flexible type of thing in C#. You can cast things in and out of objects as long as you know that they're actually going to be that type of object. We're going to take advantage of this in our form. I'm also just going to say that we want to support a default index in the combo box by default. So I'm going to say private integer is equal to default index. This is in case the user knows they want to start at a different position in the combo box when it loads versus just the first object. So we can now say these are form properties. Now let's focus on actually initializing our form. So the first thing we need is actually some arguments. There's not really a lot of arguments available yet. So we know that into the form, we're going to pass a few things. We're going to pass in a list of strings, which are going to be keys. Now this isn't the same as the property we just created. This is the thing being passed into the form that we can then pass to the property. Then we also need a list of objects, which we're going to call values. We need a title for the form, a string. We're also going to create a message, which we're then going to pass to the label in our form. And finally, a default index. And we're going to say by default that the default index will be -1 if not specified by the user, which intentionally indicates no index. Process it as if it doesn't need an index. Now we can actually focus on initializing our form. The first thing we're going to do is assign the icon to our form. So we're going to go using gfill or gfile, which is the shortcut I use for my file utilities. I'm going to go guru dot, in this case, what's this, utilities dot file utilities. And now I can call on that and say gfile dot set form icon. And we're just passing in the form, which in this case, like we said before, is just this. That is the form in the context of the form itself. And this will assign that icon to the form. We now need to actually set the keys of the form. So we'll say this.keys equals keys. Now notice that it sort of was going to let us get away with not saying this. And notice how this is a little bit faint here. You don't have to say this. Generally, the form will understand that you can refer to its variables without saying this, but I prefer to use the word this because it makes it really clear that that is what you're referring to in your code, and it doesn't really have a performance hit to my understanding, at least not a significant one. It's up to you if you do or don't say the word this, but my preference is to say it. I'm going to say this values equals values. So now we have keys and values living in our form object specifically. They've been passed in from the constructor, and they can be referred to anywhere else in the form's arguments or methods. I'm then going to say this default index is equal to default index. This text equals title. And now we're going to refer to the tooltip. So I'm going to say this dot label. So now we're actually retrieving a component from our form. And then we can modify its properties. So I'm going to say the labels text property becomes message. So this is where the power of form starts to appear. We're actually able to modify the components dynamically in our behind code. So I'm now setting the text of a property of a component in the form to a variable. Now by default, we're going to tell this form that it is going to have been cancelled by default. This is so that if someone goes and clicks the cross, the form doesn't have some way to interact with that component, to my understanding. So this is going to know that by default, unless we've told our form that it has been given an OK, it's going to be cancelled. And we can catch this in our method that we put around this form later. So I'm going to say this dialog result, which is a property of the form by default. We're going to say by default, it is cancelled. So this form is cancelled by default. We're also going to tell this form something about its tag. Now, a tag is a very powerful thing in a form. It can effectively be anything, but it's a thing that the form carries with it as it finishes and as it's processed. So we're going to use this to actually carry the objects through the form that we need. So in this case, this will be our value in principle. But I'm going to say this tag is equal to null by default. The tag doesn't have a value. So we've now initialized all of these properties. The first thing we need to do actually is load up our combo box with things. So we could either do it in the constructor, or we could build a method that loads up the combo box instead. I much prefer to usually put these things in separate methods and call on them because it makes the constructor easier to read and understand. So I'm actually going to go and create a new private void, and I'm going to call this populate combo box. Now we're going to have access to keys and values as a property outside of our constructor at this point, because if we've already passed keys and values to the private properties or variables. So the first thing we need to do is generally I like to clear the object, because this means we can use this later as a repopulate method if we need to. Although we don't need to really clear the first time around, there's no harm in doing it. So clearing a form control effectively just removes all the objects from it. So if this combo box already had things in it, it would just clear it all out. So we're going to say in this case, this combo box items, and we're just going to clear all the items. This will empty out any items that might have been in that combo box. Now we're actually going to load up the combo box with keys. So we're going to say for each bar key in keys, or this dot keys, we're going to say this dot combo box items add key. So this will add each key to the combo box as an item. It will just be a piece of text in principle. But the important thing here is that each object is added to the combo box, so we know that the index of the object we pick from the combo box can be used to draw upon the value at that index in the values that we're holding in the background when we finally make our selection at the end of the form. Now we're now going to process the default index to tell the combo box to select the first object if possible. There's going to be a few scenarios we need to anticipate here. If we have no objects in our combo box, then we're not going to want to tell the combo box to select an object, because that could be quite dangerous. So in this case, I will say if, we need to check for two things here. So we need to make sure that first of all, is the default index above 0 or equal to 0? So we're going to say, is the default index greater than or equal to 0? We also need to check, is that index less than the number of objects in the combo box? Because if we go above the end of the combo box, we're going to hit an error. We're going to try and index something that doesn't exist. So we're also going to say, does this default index, is it less than combo box items count? And if it is, we can then set the index of the combo box. So I can say this combo box selected index is equal to default index. So that is a safe way that we can set the currently selected object of the combo box. Now, if it's not possible at this point, we've got a few options of what we can do. We can just leave the combo box with nothing initialized, or we can just try to select the first object in the combo box anyway, because there will be scenarios where we might specify an index higher than the combo box, but we still want to pick the first object anyway, even if the user makes that error. I'm going to say else, and we're going to just try to set it. So we're going to say this combo box selected index equals to 0. Now, if this couldn't happen, we know that our combo box is empty. So we're just going to catch this and just say this combo box selected index is equal to -1. And what that will do is just set the combo box to have nothing selected. Now, it's up to you how you want your combo box to behave by default. Maybe you do want nothing to be selected by default. I like my combo box by default to select the first object in the list, so it's really obvious to the user what types of things are in this combo box, and it encourages interaction with the combo box from there. So that's effectively our populate combo box method, and we can just call on this in our constructor. So once our form has all its properties, we then tell the combo box to be loaded up, and it's good to go. So the last thing we need to do here is actually specify what happens when the user hits OK. So we're going to come down to our OK button click method. And at this point, we're going to do a few things. So first of all, we have to check, do we actually have a selected index? Is the index greater than -1? So I'm going to say if this combo box selected index is greater than or equal to 0, which we know is a valid index, and then we can work with this index. We're then going to get the selected value that that index represents. So I'm going to say that the selected value is equal to values indexed, and this will be, this dot values, and it will be from the combo box's selected index, which we know has to be within the range of the keys that populated the combo box, so it's going to be a valid call. So what this has done is taken the key the user's focusing on and said, go and get the value from the original list of values that was aligned to those keys. Now that we have this object, we want to actually return it through the form. So I'm going to say this.tag is equal to the selected value. And this will currently be an object, so we can just leave it as such. We're also just going to say that this dialog result is equal to dialog result OK. So we don't want that or symbol there. And this will have told our form that the form has successfully ran. So until we hit this point, if our form gets cancelled at any point, we can also catch this by checking the returned dialog result of our form when we use it. So that's effectively it. It's a very simple little form, only about 80 lines of code with no comments really. And we can also get rid of pretty much all of that. But in principle, we've constructed our form, populated the combo box. We've got an event when we hit the OK button and an event when we hit the cancel button. And that is effectively it. But we can't actually use this form yet. We have to call it through something like a method. So this is where we're going to return back to something we set up earlier, which is our custom class. So I'm going to return to the custom class of our forms namespace, where we initially had a form for messages. So we're just going to minimize our message forms and we're going to start constructing a method to call on our actual form. So in this case, it will be a public static method that will return a form result. Just like our message box class, we're going to return a form result, which lets us process the outcome of the form. And I'm just going to say this is going to be a select from dropdown. Now we could also just call this dropdown maybe. I'm going to be a bit more specific and say this is a select from dropdown form. So what do we want to specify? Well, of course, we're going to redeclare the types of things we need to pass in, like keys and values, which we're going to pass down to our base form. And of course, we're going to have a title, which now we're going to initialize as null if it's not provided, and a message that is also null. And I might just put this on a new line. And then finally, as you might guess, we're going to get a default index, which is -1. So we're now just going to basically call on our base form and process its outcomes into a form result. So first of all, we're going to make a new form result. So I'm going to say var form result is equal to new form result. And we're going to say by default that it is not valid by default. Now I think I've missed something here. I'll just make sure my form result has the validated scenario. Oh, it does. Yeah, okay. I just didn't give that a name. Because we do have this initial constructor is valid. I've called it something different to what I'm used to, that's why. So we're going to say is valid is equal to false. By default, this form will be treated as cancelled, invalid, and no affirmative outcome. But now we're actually going to work with our form. So the first thing we'll do is set default values for the title and the message. So I'm going to say title, and we're going to use the null coalescing operator and just say select, or we'll just say select from dropdown. And then for message, we'll just null coalesce that as selects an object from the dropdown. But the next step is we actually have to work with our form. So we're going to use a using statement here in order to achieve this. So we're going to say process the form. So I'm going to say using, and we're going to say var form is new, in this case, base dot dropdown. And then we're going to provide all the arguments it expects, values, keys, or keys, values, title, message, default index. And now we can actually work with this form. So what's going to happen is we need to actually show the form. So I'm going to just take a shortcut and say if, when we show the form, it is equal to dialog result OK, then we know at this point we can now work with the outcome of the form. We no longer treat it as cancelled. So this will in turn actually show the form even though it's in an if statement. But we're catching the outcome as well as showing it all in one little action there. And all I have to do now is take advantage of my validate method, which I placed in my form result class earlier, which you might recall if we provide an object to it, we'll validate the form, which will set it to not cancelled, not valid, and affirmative. And we'll also set the object property of the form result to that object that we're passing as the validation. So if I go back to my argument here, I can now say form result, in this case, validate. Whoops, I want to call it the actual object, not the class. And we can now pass, in this case, the forms tag as an object. So the form tag is generally going to be an object by default, but again, I like to specify what it should be, just in case down the line we make it something else that we need to cast into an object or as an object. But at this point, we now have our form result captured if we didn't cancel the form. So we can just return the result. And that will satisfy the return type of our form, and it now functions as intended. So now we have a means of calling on our form using a list of objects. We're going to go one step further than this again, and we're going to create a specific form that implements this to select revisions. So this will be part of a bigger workflow that we're working towards over the next few videos to apply revisions to sheets. So we're going to take this method, and I'm going to extend the document class in order to be able to show this form to the user. So I'm just going to minimize this and go over to our extensions, and I'm actually going to create a new extension first. So I want to extend the revision class to create a method that lets us quickly build a name for a revision. So I'm going to make a new class, and I'm just going to call this revision underscore ext, belonging to the extensions namespace, and we're going to have a public. I think this should be a static class. I'll just double check my document extension just to make sure. Yep, public static class. So this will be revision underscore ext. And I'm going to make, in this case, a public static method to return a name, so a string. And I'm going to call this ext for an extension method. And I'm going to say to revision key. So I like to call keys as names when I'm converting the name of an object into something a bit more representative of it. So in this case, we're going to build a fairly human readable name for a revision. So we'll have things like the sequence number and the name, etc. in there. So we're going to pass in a revision, and it's going to be extended. So this revision. And I'm also going to have a Boolean to include the ID. By default, that will be false. That's if we want to append the element ID on the end of the name, which sometimes might be helpful in certain types of interfaces. First of all, we need to catch if the revision is null, which it already knows we want to do. And I'm just going to return, in this case, invalid revision, just in case someone does accidentally pass a null as a revision into this method. After this, we can check, do we want to include the ID? If we do, then we're going to return a formatted string. And in this case, we're going to begin with the revision's sequence number. I'm just going to put a colon after that, and then we'll have the revision's date, revision date, dash, and then the revision description. And then we'll also just have, in this case, the revision's ID. To a string. So we have to say revision, and I'll put it in square brackets, and we'll just say revision.id to string. And that effectively builds a nice little formatted string that represents it. If we don't want to include the ID, then we just do that minus the revision on the end. So I'll just take this string and just trim off that bit on the end. So we'll have the sequence number, the date, the description, and the ID optionally. And that's pretty much it. So in this case, we now have a means of converting a revision to a really human-friendly name for forms very quickly, which we're going to take advantage of in this final form that we're constructing. So we're almost there. But in this case, we're going to come to our document extension. And after our specific collectors, we're going to add, in this case, some forms. And I might be more specific and say these are going to be class-based forms, or Revit class-based forms, or Revit collector-based forms, let's call them. Just collector-based forms. And these will generally be forms that try to show a set of objects to the user to pick from. So we're going to call this form in this case. And actually we do need to add a namespace here. So we'll say guru, so we'll say gform is equal to guru.forms. So we can call on that really quickly and easily using a using statement. Now I'm going to have a public static form result, which I need to reference from the gform namespace, but this is the return type. And I'm just going to call this ext underscore select revision. So I'm not saying select revisions because I'm just picking from a dropdown in this case. So of course we want to extend our document class. And in this case, we want to say we have a title, which by default will be null, message, which will also be null by default. And we'll also say that we want to sort as a Boolean, which by default will say is true. So this is getting a little bit long, so I might just put these on a new line as well. And in this, we're now just gonna use our base form and the method we just created to implement a form that shows revisions in that way. So I'm firstly just going to set default values. So title, again, title will use the null coalescing operator. We're going to be using this a lot in forms. So I'll say select a revision will be the title, message will be select a revision below. And that way we don't have to specify the title, but if we want to change the way that we read the title of the message, we can. So this will make it very easy to call on this form. We're now going to get revisions. We're going to say var revisions is equal to doc underscore ext get revisions, which is a method that we created in a previous lesson. So we've created a extension on the document class, which gets revisions from that document. And in this case, we also want to provide the sorted method. So we're going to say sorted and pass that down so that we can sort the revisions in this method, which is a behavior already built into that method. We're now going to process this into keys and values. So we're going to say that in this case, keys is going to be equal to revisions. And we're going to use, in this case, the system link methods that we learned about previously. I'm going to say select. I'm going to call the revision R. And I'm now going to take advantage of that extension method we created for the toRevision key. And this will turn the revisions into a human-friendly name that we've just defined to list. So this is our keys. Our values is going to be a lot more straightforward. It's revisions, but we're just going to cast them into objects because our form wants objects to list. So we now have a valid set of keys and values to manage in parallel in our form. We'll now return the form outcome. And we're just going to return, in this case, the custom select from dropdown. We have our keys, so we'll say keys, values, title, message. And by default, our default index we'll just leave alone as -1. We're not really worried about it. So that's effectively it. Now we could also specify default index as 0, I guess, if we wanted to, but I think we can probably just leave it as such. And that's effectively our form for selecting revisions created. But along the way, we've created a lot of utilities that we're going to use for other types of similar forms. So we have our base form, we have our method that implements our base form. We now have a customization on that implementation to select revisions, but we can use that middle ground implementation for many other purposes. So the last step is actually to test that this all actually works. Now we have an ambiguous reference, I just noticed. This looks like a bit of a hangover, but we can see view is from a previous lesson and it's ambiguous. So I'm just going to go and actually fix that. And like we saw before, we can do this by actually specifying out the ambiguity by being more specific about what that thing is. So I'll say view is equal to Autodesk Revit db view, and that should fix that ambiguity using. There we go. And we also have an error. I think I've missed just an encapsulation in my revision extension. So I think otherwise we're in the clear. So what we're going to do is go back to one of our classes, just a general command, and I'm just going to remove some of this logic from before. We're going to work with our push button command, and I'm just going to select a revision. So I'm going to call on this form. So I don't know if I have, I have gform available. So I'm going to say var revision result. So this is going to be a form result for selecting a revision. We're going to say gform.custom. Actually, no, we're not going to do that. What am I talking about? We're going to go doc ext, and we want, I hate when programs do that. And we'll go get revisions, and sorted is true by default. So we can just say, that's it. Now that we have this form result, we need to process it. So remember, we're returning a form result, and we can check if this thing has been canceled. I'm going to say if revision result canceled. Oh, whoop. That should be right. Oh no, this is a list of revisions. We don't want a list of revisions. Ah, of course, I'm not calling on the form. I need to call on the form. Now I should be able to check if that was canceled. Yep. We can just, at that point, cancel the overall command. Finally, I can say selected revision is equal to revision result dot object as revision, which we know it will be. So we've successfully processed the form at this point and got a revision. We can always just check that it worked. So what I'll do in here is I'll just show a message as part of the form, and I'll just say the message is equal to selected revision ext to revision key. So we'll show that human-friendly name, and finally I'll just return result succeeded. So let's actually just go and now test this out. I'm just going to boot up Revit 2023. And hopefully now when we run that push button, it will run the form that selects the revision, returns that the name of the revision was found, and then finally we're ready to go on to our next form in the next lesson. So a fairly complex lesson there. We covered a lot of stuff. I know that there's a lot to absorb there, but hopefully this shows, I guess, a way that you can implement forms in a more flexible way by creating a few stages of classes that call each other. So I'm just going to load my toolbar. And of course, I'm going to need to go into a project that actually has revisions. You may want to build some logic into some of your forms where you know there might be no objects to put into the form. For example, if you have sheets aren't always going to be there. I think you always need at least one revision, so this one's pretty safe. Okay, so once this boots up, we'll go to Guru, button, and there we go, there's our form. We can see that it resizes to suit, and if there was more than one revision, we could pick it from there. Let's actually just create more than one. Notice I just cancelled my form there, and that processed as well. Button, and there we go. We can pick our form from our dropdown. So let's pick 3. We can notice that our extension method for the revision is working. Sequence number, date, name. Okay, that. And there we go. We've just picked that from the list and passed it forward into our script. So that's effectively our form functioning and complete. It's a very basic form. Some of the other forms we use will be more complicated, but a lot of the logic we've learned in this lesson we'll be able to apply more quickly, such as doing things like setting up OK buttons and cancel buttons and labels and table layouts. So I won't be able to have to spend as much time on those steps in future lessons, but that effectively is, I guess, our form set up and functional. So if you got yours to work, well done. There's your first Windows form up and running. If you're keen to see more forms and implementations, I've got many more over on GitHub in my toolbar gWhiz, which you actually saw me go and borrow very quickly from during our lesson to do the use Windows forms property on our manifest. But if you like what you saw, feel free to comment, subscribe, share, let other people know about it. I'm hoping to see more people jump on the series. Like, I don't think there's really many series out here like this that are free. So I hope other people do start sharing it, just so more people can learn about C# without spending a lot of money. But anyway, rant over. You can reach me at the email below or by dropping a comment, and I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.